So, Steve, every time somebody talks about real estate, somebody else tends to bring up a story, particularly a horror story about what can go wrong. One example, it was just a few years ago out in California, a dentist, they had their real estate property that they were renting through Airbnb. Before you know it, they got into a situation where the tenant stayed roughly 500 days longer than they were supposed to. Not only that, but that tenant basically said, if you want me to leave, you need to pay me $100,000. It turned into a big mess, made a lot of news at the time, and it made me think. That's just one example of a large story. There's those smaller ones. If real estate is as challenging as that, why wouldn't someone just go and invest in index funds and avoid that problem altogether?
Yeah. Well, I got two things. First of all, one of my clients is actually a real estate attorney in Los Angeles. And it's funny. I mean, she can't tell me names and details, but she shares those stories with me from time to time. And they're true. There's several of them in California in particular. So yeah, why would you go through that? Well, because it's profitable. I mean, if you build the right systems and processes, you can avoid a lot of those things. But when you look at the index fund, yeah, that's an easy way. And sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. But, if you paid attention to the podcast last week, you realize that, what most people think of on real estate is only on the surface. They're looking at this amount of profit, but they're not looking at all those things underneath besides the cash flow, the appreciation, the tax benefits, boom, boom, all those things. You add those all together and yeah, it's worth going into real estate. There's a reason that, most billionaires have a real estate portfolio. So hopefully that answered your question.
Well, so it kind of sounds like, just to paraphrase that, there's risk in any sort of investment.
Mhm.
And so part of what we want to do to mitigate that risk really goes back to making sure that potentially we have those systems in place so that we can receive the reward that we're trying to achieve. Is kind of that how you would describe it? All these nightmare scenarios that are in real estate, we avoid that based off of the systems that we have in place.
Yeah, and there's two parts to that. One of them are systems. And again, you look at risk management. Years ago, when I was a financial planner, I mean, I had to take a course on risk management. You want to, reduce the risk as much as you can. Then, you do things to avoid the risk. Then you do things to kind of mitigate the risk, and then you insure the risk. So there's different steps you do. When you think about it from a real estate investing, how can you reduce the risks? Well, there's certain steps you put into place, provisions you put into place to reduce that risk. And then there are things you can do to, okay, the risk is still there, but how can I reduce the impact of that risk? And so, again, there's different things you do within real estate. And so, yeah, you cannot eliminate all the risk, but there's a lot of steps you can take to reduce it or to, I hate to say, put it off onto other people, but that's why you hire a property manager to do these things for you. So is there a risk that the toilet will clog and need to be, someone have to go there at 2 a.m. to fix it? There is that risk. That will never go away, but you can put that on someone else's plate. That's why you hire a property manager. I've never had to unclog a tenant toilet. I don't plan on ever doing that because I have, I don't have systems that will prevent it, but there are things that I can do to put that on someone else's plate. Now, I'll share an example of a story that I have. I bought a 5-unit property years and years ago. I bought it pretty decent, simple 1-story brick, kind of an unusual layout, just kind of a big L shape. And there were 2 tenants in it and 3 vacancies. I'm like, cool, I'm going to buy this property, do a little rehab, fill those other 3. And based on the numbers, it was a really strong cash flowing property. What I didn't know is that the 2 people there was a mother in 1 unit and a daughter in another who had mastered the way of keeping the entire building to themselves and never getting kicked out. Every showing we had, they would come out of their unit and tell the people how crappy this building was, the termites and the cockroaches and the rats and they're just making up lies because they wanted the entire building to themselves. And so we couldn't place a tenant there because they would scare every single potential tenant away. We couldn't kick them out because they were, again, they'd become masters of going to court to, it's like, oh, well, it's a new owner. Then, they filed something that made us start the entire eviction process over. And then when they did this, like, well, this medical thing happened and grant me another 90 days and just, we eventually got them out of there, but it was a pain. And my point of all that is, yeah, that was a risk. And, long term, we got them out of there, rented it, and it was a great property for years and years to come. But it was 3 or 4 months of a royal pain. Now, I would never have done that myself. Now I would use a property manager, and the property manager has different paperwork in place, different legal procedures in place. When I first bought that property, I was not a licensed property manager. I was not an expert landlord. I didn't know all the papers and the things I should have put in place that would have made those evictions much easier. And that's where you get into those processes and those steps. I could have avoided that had I had better paperwork, better contracts, things like that. And so again, you do what you can to reduce the risk, and you do what you can to put some of those things onto someone else's plate, such as the property manager's plate, instead of your own.
Well, one of the things that I think about with what you're talking about there goes back to, I think, particularly for someone who has never invested in a property that is not designed to be their living space or their forever home. They're potentially looking at it from the perspective of, what would I want to live in?
Mhm.
What would I want to have? And that can actually really be a detriment from the perspective of making a property be a great investment property.
Right.
If you think about it from that perspective, just for people listening, why would that be?
Yeah.
What
Well,
causes a great, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, a great question. And I have a specific example. Lady came to me because she knew I was, involved in real estate investing, and said, "Hey, I've got this property. Can you help me buy this?" Now, she was doing a fix and flip, and she had bought it, rehabbed it to the way she liked it, and was trying to sell it. But the problem is, she was trying to sell it for a price that was unrealistic in that neighborhood. This is a lower end neighborhood, and she had put in high end countertops, high end this, fancy that, fancy this. And in order for her to make any money on it, she had to put it at a price that was well above anything in that neighborhood that had ever sold. She had developed it to the point that she liked it, not to the point of what would sell in that neighborhood. And again, she just didn't understand, and I've seen that a few times before where people have done something like that, because you have to understand your market for that property. I have a lot of properties. There are some of them that, yeah, I'd live in that property. That's pretty good. Some of them that, if I had to. And there's some of my properties I'm like, I would not live in. That is not either a neighborhood, a property, or something about that. But that doesn't make it a bad investment. As a matter of fact, some of those have been the best investments, because there's always demand for it. There's always people needing places to live. There's always, people available. And so you don't want to look at an investment property, whether to buy or to rehab, or during the rehab process, with the viewpoint of, what would I want there? Okay. So always think about what is appropriate for that property in that neighborhood, as opposed to what's appropriate for you.
Well, one of the things, and some people, particularly people who haven't been in the real estate space before, might look at this very cynically and say, well, that means you're making a terrible house and, these are horrific conditions or whatever else. But that's really not what we're talking about at
Not
all.
even close.
Really, what we're talking about is, realistically, within a given area, you know, if we use a system to look at what that market supports,
Mhm.
what makes practical sense from a rent perspective, from a location perspective, even something from the perspective of how many bedrooms does this need to have? Is this going to be a tougher thing to rent or
Right.
not? That goes back to the process. And I'd put it to you this way, and I'd be curious about your thoughts on that. This is where actually I've heard before some people describe it like this, which is that it is not the property that has nearly as much value in real estate as the process that you have supporting it, because the property is relatively interchangeable if you've lined everything else up. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And you got two things there, because I want to take a step back first.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, it's like, gosh, you're doing really good rehabs on these properties, and it's just the opposite. If you go into if you think of properties like, like grades A, B, C, D, and F, and you're in a C neighborhood and you do a B rehab, you're actually lifting up the quality of that neighborhood. You're making a better property in a better neighborhood. Now, you may live in an A house and looked at, oh, B, I wouldn't live there. That's not a very good rehab, but it is a step up from what is already there, and it's one of the nicer ones in the neighborhood. And that's how we look at it. House, hey, this has no cockroaches. It's clean. It's fresh coat of paint, fresh flooring, brand new kitchen appliances, brand new furnace that always works, that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, it still may not be an A neighborhood property, but it's rehabbed and it's a big step up for that neighborhood. So I just wanted to kind of mention that, state that based on what you said first about, the quality of the rehabs. For the other part, I mean, the house is the asset. I mean, that is the value, but you're right. It's the processes and systems that make it profitable. Okay. You can buy a house and, maybe turn around and sell it a week later. And if you haven't done anything to it, it doesn't lose value. But you're not going to increase the value. You're not going to make it easy. You're not going to turn it into a cash flowing asset, those sorts of things, unless you have the processes and systems to do so. Yeah, the systems you talk about, that's what turns a physical property into a profitable business.
One of the things that you think about with any of this, whether you're talking about trying to rent to a tenant or you're trying to do a fix and flip and sell to a long-term buyer, in both those sort of scenarios, I think it's important utilizing those systems or those
Mhm.
processes to really think about where demand is. It's, you brought up, that example earlier of, hey, these fit my tastes, but are your tastes necessarily popular? Or are they a little bit, eccentric or whatever else? And I think we've all seen some of those properties where, hey, this is a very unique property, but there might only be, 1 out of 10 people who'd be interested in being in it versus, 7 out of 10 with goes back to the classic, hey, are we doing beige walls or whatever else because that gets the most amount of buyers, or at least, historically back in the day.
So,
Yeah.
people may not know this. We're in Indianapolis. There's a very well-known house on the east side of Indianapolis where someone with a lot of money, they lived in a house, they fixed it up, very Italian, sculptures and all that sort of stuff. And they ended up buying the house next door and connecting the two. And then they bought the house on the other side and connected it. And so they have actually got three houses in the connectivity, and they have made this monstrosity of a house. It's very unique. And they loved it. They built it that way for them. But then when they went to sell it, nobody wants that really weird house. So again, it just what may appeal to one person may have no appeal to somebody else. So
Well, and so I think you're absolutely right there. And so I think if we go back to that example of saying, okay, a billionaire is willing to overcome all these sort of problems,
mhm,
or your average, 9 to 5 type person who's trying to go into this market is willing to overcome the horror stories in real estate by making sure that they have a system in place, right? It goes back to the idea the goal is, and avoiding problems are going to happen regardless of what you're doing.
mhm,
It's building systems that survive them.
mhm.
And so we're talking about systems a lot. You talk about a property manager. Are there other aspects of a system? We've talked a little bit about comparative analysis in terms of what a market supports. Is there anything else you'd want to share there?
Yeah, well, look at the entire process. I mean, when you go to invest in real estate, the first thing you have to do is you have to find a property, and that takes a system. I mean, you can go on to MLS and try and find properties. You can go into Zillow, but those are usually market price. Those are usually people who have those are higher priced properties than they should be most often. You can get better deals if you have a system in place to find off market properties, to find distressed sellers that are they're not, they don't have time to wait a month or two or three to sell it to a realtor. They got to sell it in the next week or two, and they're willing to discount the price accordingly. Do you have a system to find those discounted properties from motivated sellers? So finding the property is one. Evaluating the property. Okay. When you go to evaluate it, there's several parts. The biggest part, rehab. Is this a $20,000 rehab or an $80,000 rehab? You have to have a system to know what needs to be fixed, what doesn't. Of the things that need to be fixed, how much is that? Is this a $6,000 furnace or a $9,000 furnace? You've got to be able to have systems that can tell you those things. Now that you know the rehab amount, what's it worth after rehab? Well, you've got to have a system for identifying good comps. What is a real comp? Again, that may sound pretty easy. It's not. There's a lot of things in here. It's like it's based on price per square foot, and therefore this 1,000 square foot house is worth this much based on these 5 comps. Well, that makes sense and could be, but I know like here in town, I had one just a couple days ago that the comp was incredibly wrong because they had included the square footage of the basement in the entire house. Hey, this is a 2,000 square foot house. No, it's not. It's really a 1,000 square foot house. And so the person who ran the comps priced it at twice what it's really worth because they didn't have the systems to ask the right questions, to identify the right information, to get an accurate ARV. And so when you're acquiring, you find the off-market property from the motivated seller, you get a good rehab estimate, you determine the comps, Now you can determine the right price. You have to have systems to do all those things. Once that's done, you're still getting started. You've got to rehab it, unless you buy a turnkey property. But now you got to rehab it. You got to manage the contractor, do those sorts of things. And as long as you have systems, how do you monitor? How do you make sure the repairs are on budget, on time, and done correctly? Those are your big three. Yeah, I'll repeat that. Rehab, make sure all the repairs are on budget, on time, and done correctly. It takes systems to do that. Once the rehab is done, great. You've got a rehab property. You're either going to flip it or get a tenant. If you're going to get a tenant, get a property manager. That's the piece we were talking about earlier, but all those other things are systems and processes before you even get to the property manager. But yeah, you hire a good property manager, and they're going to have the tools to get it in front of as many tenants as possible, to do the showings, to do the screenings, background checks, credit checks. Is this a tenant who's actually going to pay? Those sorts of things. And then once the tenant is in, contract signed, they're paying rent, there's going to be repairs from time to time. There's going to be issues from time to time. There's going to be a tenant who falls behind. The property manager has those systems in place on what to do, how to collect, how to do those things. In worst case scenario, they've got the systems for how to evict. And so all those are steps and processes in a system. And if you've got all those, you can make a lot of money in real estate. But if you don't have any of those, or even if you're missing a few key pieces, it can be very complicated to be profitable.
Well, let's think about this from two different perspectives with what you're talking about. The previously, you've brought up the idea of working with experts in this sort of way. The advantage of working with an expert is they have that knowledge base where they've already made all the mistakes, so to speak. And through that experience, you don't have to make those mistakes because they did it for you.
Right.
Right. So there is that angle to think about. And you brought up property manager, you brought up contractors. In some ways, not to get too comic booky, but it's almost like, any successful real estate opportunity really has a team of real estate Avengers who are coming together with their own unique skills
Mm-hmm.
to be able to fast forward you towards not just optimizing the property through the process, but making sure that you are effective with the way that you do that. And
I'd tell
so,
you, I like that. Real estate
yeah,
Avengers. I'm going to share that with my team. I'm going to get them costumes. I think they're going to like that.
at the very least, they can do that for Halloween, right?
Yeah, there you go.
When you think about some of those different pieces, and I think that's something where, we live in a world, especially with YouTube, where people want to be the do-it-yourselfer. There's something empowering about it and so forth. But simultaneously, it shouldn't be dismissed that, yes, within anything that you're doing, you can try to do it yourself. But there's also that advantage when you look at it from the perspective of, hey, do you have any real experience with real estate law? Do you have any real experience with doing that comparative analysis on the properties? Do you have any real sort of experience in literally working with your hands and building these different things? There's a lot of different pieces there. And if we think about it from that perspective, what you're doing, if you're doing it yourself, is you're utilizing that sweat equity. But
Mm-hmm.
what you're not utilizing is maximizing your bandwidth to do other things. So where you're saving money here, you're potentially losing out on revenue somewhere else because you're spending your time trying to figure it all out.
Okay.
And so if you think about
And
it
I got an
from that
example for that,
perspective,
by
what
the
would you
way.
say? Yeah.
I'm sorry. And I got an example for that, by the way, but I didn't hear your actual question.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that entire premise?
So I'm going to share an example. A guy I talked to, it's been several years. He was a flipper. While he was flipping his first property, he was he was not months into it. He was towards the end of it. He was just a few weeks from listing it for sale. And he told me how much money he was going to make on this house. So it looked like he was going to make about $30,000 on that flip, which that sounds great. But there's more. He's owned the property for a year and a half. He did all the work himself, but he had a 9 to 5 job about an hour away. And so for a year and a half, he gave up his evenings and his weekends to drive an hour, do the work, drive home. Drive an hour, do the work, drive home after work every day, and then on the weekends for a year and a half to save money on a contractor. And so, yes, did he save money? Possibly. Did he spend a lot of time? Absolutely he did. But a contractor probably could have got that job done in 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 months. He spent a year and a half. How much extra did it cost him every month in utility bills, insurance, taxes? If he had financing, he was paying interest on that every month. That was an entire year's worth of those expenses that he paid that he didn't have to, besides his own time. And so you can do these things yourself. You're right. You can go fix a house yourself, but you've got to look at all the factors in there, not just the savings, but the time and the cost of money, the cost of holding a property for a long time. You got to factor all that in to the equation.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about there is, you have all those different HGTV type shows where you have the celebrity remodeler who, they're there for the film shoots are only showing a very small portion of a six
Yep.
to 12 week build out or whatever else. There's an entire team behind who just never gets featured on video. And so there can be a little bit of misinformation there for all those pieces, right?
Can I go a step deeper on that?
Yeah.
So I'm in several masterminds with other real estate developers around the country, other people who do different things. There's a friend of mine who actually had his own show on HGTV. I don't want to say who it is because I don't want to get him in trouble. But I joked that someone asked me one time, "Well, how come you don't have your own show?" I'm like, "Well, look at him. He's like 6'3" Italian guy. He looks like a model, and his wife is a model." I'm like, "Well, they have the TV show. Look at me." But one of the things he told me is he said they record it, they do this. They said they do this for entertainment purposes, and that the numbers that they share are not always accurate. And he said, for example, we actually oftentimes have the studio will set up predetermined buyers of that property at a price that makes it look good. Things like that I would have never known had I been just watching the show without knowing some behind the scenes information. And so like, oh yeah, we made $75,000 on this flip. Yeah, because the studio arranged it to make sure that it made money, so it looked good for the show. So some of those shows are not accurate from that standpoint. But to your point, they're also showing, some of these will show an entire flip in an hour. But that is it's a 6-month flip, but with a few different recordings, but it doesn't show the big picture.
Well, it's a good thing to point out as well, right? Which is whether we see it on the internet or on television, just because it's on one of those two places or social media, maybe that doesn't mean it's true.
Right. Well, and
Right.
I'll
Right.
share another one. A lot of people talk about you can get involved in real estate with no money down, nothing out of pocket, and build your own real estate fortune. And that sounds great. Last week I'd mentioned, no, if you have 25,000 or less, I wouldn't bother trying yet. You need to save up a little bit more. And the reason I say that is, there are ways you can do it, but it is really hard. You may have heard of something called subject to. I bought 15 to 20 properties subject to the existing mortgage. Don't want to get into the details of it. It's kind of complicated. It's a royal pain. You have to spend a ton of time learning it, finding the properties, negotiating. There are very few scenarios where it can actually be done. And it took me several years to do that a few times. But it is a way that you can get into a property for less money, but it's really hard and it doesn't fit for most people. If you're looking at real estate as a passive investment, that ain't it. It's really hard to find those. And so a lot of those things out there where they say, hey, you can get in, no money down, and you just need a few bucks to get in real estate or whatever, it's because they're going to sell you a class or a system. So they may, that's going to tell you these things, but a lot of times it's just not true. You do need to have some capital. Now, you don't need to buy the entire house with cash. You can get financing, you can get leverage. But when they say zero money and you can make a fortune in real estate, a lot of times that is not completely accurate.
Well, I think one of the things to look at, particularly those type of programs, which are designed or advertised as being a side hustle that could
Mm-hmm.
potentially turn into a full-time job, I think there's a big key there to look at. It is closer to unless you're that outlier who happens to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
It tends to be more of a full-time job. It certainly isn't a passive investment when you
No,
look at the amount of work that it takes to, find that needle in a haystack. Even if you have great systems in place, availability is going to be what it is, and it can take a lot of no's before you get to that yes.
that's right.
And so at that point, you've made no income to find that one opportunity for very cheap. Everyone has to decide how they want to spend their free time,
Yep.
but simultaneously, you're not making anything until you do find that opportunity. Which brings me to that other point. Part of what we've talked about is having that team, right? The real estate Avengers, property
Yeah.
manager you started with first, right? When did you realize trying to do everything yourself wasn't sustainable?
Well, there's a couple parts. There's not profitable and not sustainable. I realized pretty on if I wanted to continue scaling that no, I can't continue scaling the number of properties I can manage. So I figured out pretty early on that okay, this isn't sustainable for me to find them, manage the rehabs, manage the tenants, do all those things. And so, I mean, it didn't take too long to figure that out. I mean, once you hit five, six, seven properties, I mean, again, and keep in mind, I was doing it as pretty much my full time job. And so, if you're doing it as a side hustle or, even as if you got a full time job and this is just an investment, it doesn't take long before you realize that it's just not scalable beyond just a handful of properties. Now, I think I've shared before the example of a tenant that I was trying to find a new tenant. And that's when I realized that a property manager can do it better than me. That was really one of the big turning points where I spent several months. I lowered the price, couldn't find a tenant, lowered the price, had a couple showings, drove up there, showed it to a few people. They weren't interested, dropped the price again. And after 4 months of sitting on a vacant property, not cash flowing, not making a dime, I said, I'm going to give a property manager a shot at this. They had a tenant within 2 to 3 weeks. And that tenant was paying what I originally thought I could rent it for. And my net cash flow after paying the property manager was more than I was trying to place a tenant for by the end of that. And so that's when I realized, well, wait a minute, I'm making more money with a property manager in place than I was when I was doing it on my own, and they're doing all the work. That was really kind of the final, yeah, I've got to do more delegating, more finding good teams to do these things so that it becomes scalable.
Well, I think that's a great point, right? One of the first rules of management is you're trying to hire your replacement, someone
Yeah,
who is better at doing whatever the task is that you are,
yeah,
because that allows, an amplification of efforts for growth for the entire organization or business, whatever it is. Now, taking your point, just to think about this, we've talked about, contractors, maybe even, accountants or CPAs kind of putting these pieces together. But there's one other aspect of the real estate Avengers which should not be ignored. And what that really is, you hinted at this, but if we look at, a place like Zillow. On the one hand, I love Zillow. It's very easy to access. There are other called insider tools that exist that have more information than what is on Zillow.
mhm,
But if we look at how Zillow has changed the game for your average consumer, it's basically like a giant mall. And, whereas 15, 20 years ago, whenever that was, you had to entirely, you know, work with a realtor who was
yeah,
going through the MLS to try to pull something up, that having that information at your fingertips is very useful. It's nothing against realtors.
yeah,
It's everything to do with, being able to see things with your own eyes to get through that process faster to see what resonates.
mhm,
But the thing that Zillow is, it's kind of like an online shopping mall.
mhm,
And if we look at the best deals that you can find on real estate, it's probably not going to be at that online shopping mall. It's probably going to be members of your team that are part of your network, investor relationships,
yep.
those off market deals, right? Professional investors, they're going to spend most of their time trying to buy before the property ever reaches the public. And what would you want to say about this entire premise?
You're right. Is that not enough? You are correct. That is, I cannot recall the last time I bought a property that was listed or on Zillow. And again, it's having the tools, so spending money on marketing to find those motivated sellers before they get around to listing the property. And so it's marketing dollars, it's networking. The properties I picked up last week, it's a guy I've known for, gosh, 6, 8 years at least. And he actually has a lending company, and a couple of clients couldn't pay. They took the house back, and it's called REO, real estate owned. Now the bank owns it. The bank doesn't want it. The people owed 100,000, and they took the property back, and now the property's worth 150. I mean, that's how the bank gets their money. Is they couldn't pay, they get the asset back. Well, they don't want the asset. Let's get rid of it. And so because I had that network, because I knew him, I was able to get a good deal there without it ever going on the MLS or Zillow or any place else. So yeah, the network is huge when it comes to finding those good deals.
Well, it's no different than if we use a car analogy, right? If you go to the dealer, you're going to pay something that is a different price than if you're
Mhm.
doing private party or wholesale.
Yeah, good analogy.
And so real estate would really work the exact same way. But I think you kind of answered that question. Buying things directly off Zillow, that's not necessarily something that you would do or have done. And so, if we kind of wrap things up for today, we've talked about the construction of the team, we've talked about systems, we've talked about processes, we've if we want to summarize, the advantages, one of the things we talked about, you know in our previous episode was specifically all the different ways that real estate can pay you. For
Mhm.
people who haven't listened to that episode yet, do you want to kind of re-summarize that?
Yeah, just real quick, most people just think of the cash flow. So, gosh, by the time I, pay my mortgage on the house and do this, my net, pay all the expenses, my net cash flow is only 200 or 300 a month. Why would I bother getting a piece of real estate? Why would I even bother getting a rental property? And so, but you look at any given month, if you look at the tax benefits, that's going to be several $100s per month if you were to prorate that every month. You think of the appreciation. You got a $250,000 house. If it goes up 4%, which is the average the last 10 years has been well above 4%, but 4% appreciation on a $250,000 house is $10,000 a year of appreciation. That means that's about $800 every month just in appreciation on average if you prorated it, by month. So yeah, your cash flow may only be 2 or 300. Your appreciation is 800. Your tax benefits are usually several hundred more, $300-400 a month. And you start adding that up and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's like $1,500 a month of benefit. Exactly. And that's what a lot of people are missing are some of those things. And so and especially if you build over time, you get the appreciation, debt pay down. That was the other one. Because every month you're paying down that mortgage. So $250,000 house, maybe you borrowed 200. Well, the next month it's 199 something. It's going down every month. And so you add all that together and the value that you're gaining every month in real estate is significant.
So if we summarize all that, right, you have these four different ways that real estate can potentially pay you. And then you have these ways to handle the nightmare real estate scenarios. That really just leaves one last question, which is always good to look back on, which is if you could advise your younger self before buying your first real estate property investment, what would be your final takeaway here? What would you say?
There's a slogan, a lot of people have heard it. When's the best time to buy real estate? 20 years ago. When's the next best time? Today. Not tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Today. Buy the real estate. I wish I had bought more real estate earlier on in my career. Again, use some leverage, use some, things like that. I mean, I would have had a much larger portfolio much sooner had I gotten started earlier. Even if I just acquired one a year, that may not sound like much. I didn't acquire any until I was 40. I mean, think about that. If I got started at 25, I would have had 15 properties by then. And so I would have started earlier, but just don't make it too complicated. Get systems, start acquiring real estate, and delegate the management of it to a team that knows what they're doing. I mean, that'd be my advice to myself from, my 20 or 25-year-old self.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. I think so many times it's easy for someone to say, hey, that sounds like a good idea, but then they don't actually take action on it. And so one of the key things you just said there was the idea of, and I think it's always important, whether you're listening to a podcast or, taking a class or whatever you're doing, to think about how can I apply whatever I'm listening
Yeah.
to what I'm doing in my own life. And, if we have that final message then today, you know, what would you suggest for how people can take action?
Well, and the key thing is take action. My suggestion, we provide those services. That's one of the things we do. I help investors all day, every day, find the properties, manage the rehabs, place property, find good property management. I help them with the financing to buy the property, to refinance it for long term, all those things. That's what we do. And so if you need help, let me know. That's what we do. If not, at least if I can't help you, go get help somewhere. But get started in real estate. It's one of those that when you look back in 10 years, you go, man, I wish I'd started that 20 years ago. So that'd be my suggestion is go take the action. If you're not sure what to do or how to do it, reach out. That's what I do. It's fun. So,
Right. Thanks, Steve. As always, we'll catch everyone next week.
okay. Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Yep. Bye.